Welcome, everyone, to this latest Talks at Google. Uh, the state of journalism is a critical topic many of us at Google grapple with as citizens, members of communities, general Googlers, or individuals working on teams that are providing news to consumers or working directly with members of the news industry. That's why I'm personally very excited to speak with our guest today, Elizabeth Green. Elizabeth is the co-founder and CEO of one of the leading lights in digital journalism, Chalkbeat. And she's also a co-founder of the American Journalism Project, an organization and funding mechanism that is attempting to seed the next generation of local news enterprises, specifically focused on large and mid-sized metropolitan markets. Today with Elizabeth, we're going to talk about three things. Generally, given Chalkbeat's focus on education, we're going to deep dive a bit on the state of education. But we also want to take time to talk to Elizabeth about her personal journey as an entrepreneur, as well as, importantly, the state of the journalism industry writ large, and some of her thoughts and feelings and perspectives on what needs to happen, both at Google and elsewhere, to support a healthy news ecosystem. Elizabeth Green, welcome.
Thank you. So good to be here. Hello, Google.
So nice of you to join us here from your home in DC. For those of us not familiar with one of your organizations that you have been involved in, Chalkbeat, tell us a little bit about it. What's your mission, your team? What makes you in particular unusual? And really here, give us your elevator pitch.
Sure. So happy to do that. Chalkbeat is a nonprofit news organization. Our mission is to inform the decisions and debates that most impact children and families. We do that through local first news. We have 8 bureaus around the country and a waiting list of 60 places that would like to become bureaus. In those places, there's a team of reporters who are doing daily coverage of local schools. And we've just started expanding into other topics. Our first new topic was voting and election administration.
Awesome. So we want to talk a little bit about education, given it's the main and priority focus of Chalkbeat. And obviously one of the biggest topics in education over the last year plus is COVID and how it's actually disrupted education. So COVID has disrupted many industries, again, few as much as education. What have we learned about virtual and remote learning as a result of the past year and a half?
Yeah, COVID is changing education a lot because so many kids were just not physically in school, of course. And now being in school continues to be disrupted by COVID. So I think what we learned is that people need to be in social environments to learn, and most people really need those to be physical and social environments to learn. And some of the also things that we learned, I think, are how valuable education is to our society. Not that was a lesson some of us needed to understand, but not only is it the way to instruct future generations, but prepare workers, prepare citizens, and provide vital childcare for our economy. So I think it also feeds in the US education and other countries. Education feeds children and families. So it provides so many services, particularly in the US, actually.
So COVID obviously massively disruptive. I want to think about dwelling a little bit on some of the biggest long-term impacts and damages being created by COVID and work from home and I guess study from home. But with a particular focus on underprivileged children and children of color in the US, what are your thoughts on the impact to that group?
Yeah. So, I mean, the truth is that we don't know yet what the long-term impacts of COVID are on education. We just don't know. Data is quite lagging in education in normal circumstances, and that continues to be true in abnormal circumstances. However, the early indicators are that it's really exacerbating existing disparities and affecting boys and boys of color, Black and Latino boys, the most. We're seeing in attendance numbers major gaps where attendance, even in virtual school versus existing patterns at in-person school, was significantly lower for boys of color. And that's quite worrisome. There's a lot of different possible explanations for that. But it's quite worrisome because attending school is a good thing for all children. And at the same time, we're also seeing patterns affecting the workforce, the educator workforce. Again, we don't yet know the long-term consequences, just like we don't have a great insight into the so-called learning loss faced by students, but we can extrapolate that not being in school is not a good thing. So the attendance numbers are a good indicator. Similarly, we don't yet know the long-term effects on the teacher workforce. However, there are some troubling early indicators about challenges retaining and attracting educators that are important to keep watching and that we're watching. And we know that historically, educator workforce challenges mostly disproportionately affect students of color.
That's fascinating. Are there any organizations that you'd or sources besides Chalkbeat, of course, that you'd recommend folks at Google who are interested in these issues, particularly COVID and young people, COVID and the education workforce, that you'd recommend they turn to learn a little bit more about this?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of great education journalism out there, not just Chalkbeat. We're unique in having a local focus. And our national newsletter is a really great place to sign up for, just to get an overview of what's going on, both what we're learning from research and very kind of community-informed perspective of trends. We also have great partners in the Hechinger Report, Education Week, are two publications that are great for understanding the pre-K to 12 education system in the U.S.
Terrific. So looking for a bit of a silver lining on the education front, what are some of the positive things that either we've discovered about education or actually that have emerged as a result of schools needing to adapt to a kind of a COVID era?
Yeah, I mean that it's very tempting to hope for silver linings out of a really terrible time. And I do have to say, in education, I think some of that hope for silver linings was not returned. And the truth is, it's just been a really challenging time for most families and most children. That said, I think this, and I just want to emphasize that COVID is intersecting, of course, with so many other patterns globally and in the US, right? So we had a dramatic racial reckoning that if you're concerned, as we all should be, I think, about boys of color, right? Having images of violence against men, Black men, both the rise, but also the backlash to the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and globally. All of these things have also been tremendous strains. We're seeing a lot of concerning data coming from the different places we cover about disruptive behavior patterns in schools affecting all children, which is very challenging for both educators and students to the learning environment, and just indicates an overall kind of obvious point, which is that just as for adults, this has been a really challenging emotional period to get through. For children, that's true as well. And none of us can learn or work effectively when we're not emotionally well. And it's been very, very challenging, I think, for so many people to be emotionally well. And children are certainly not excluded, especially after they've been without social learning opportunities and just social opportunities that they've had for so long. So in terms of silver linings, however, in this, against that backdrop of just significant disruption, I mean, by the way, I didn't even mention gun violence rising in many American communities, which for the communities that we cover can mean, somebody in my neighborhood, somebody in my family was affected by gun violence, and I'm dealing with that on top of everything else. But in this disruptive moment, there's also an opportunity for disruptive interventions in education. And at one point over the last year and a half, almost 2 years now, there was great concern, and we cover this carefully, that this challenging environment would be made even more so by a challenging fiscal situation for schools. The opposite has happened. There's been over $100 billion allocated in additional federal dollars to schools as part of the broad recovery package. And so there is certainly an opportunity for long-lasting investments that could change the way public education functions. So I think that is a potential silver lining, but also a really challenging one to take advantage of, because local people are, especially superintendents, school boards, school principals, in actually not just the US, but globally, on their shoulders rest so many incredible decisions right now. Educational decisions, but also public health decisions, and now expenditure decisions about where to make investments. And just to bring it all full circle to the elevator pitch, this really only underscores my personal commitment to journalism at this moment in time, because it is very, very challenging to be in a position of decision-making authority in any sector, I think, right now. There's so many unknowns, so many different path dependencies, and to be in that position in a particularly stressed and sometimes under-resourced sector like public education, we have to ensure that decision makers have access to information. It's just absolutely vital about the kind of interventions that can work, explanations to understand long-term trends that we're up against, and also accountability to make sure that you don't do the wrong thing. So I think there's a potential path that looks like we came out of this and it was a turning point, and we really redoubled our commitments to things we've learned over hundreds of years of American public education and globally in education, but it's going to be a challenging path to execute.
There's so much there, and I imagine we could spend the full time talking about education.
I love to do that, so I'm up whenever you want to.
Particularly, I think the kind of statistic, or at least the data point around young boys of color being disproportionately affected, and some of the kind of broader implications for that group, but also obviously some of the bigger challenges systemically. There's just so much there, but I do want to reserve a bit of time for the discussion on kind of the state of journalism and getting a little bit of a perspective from you on your entry point into journalism, as well as, again, what you think is required for a healthy journalistic ecosystem in the United States in particular. So for those of you who have kind of questions, please add them to the dory and we can address them in the time at the end of this discussion to get to some of those audience questions. So journalism, you talked a little bit about the role of journalism in essentially helping navigate and help society navigate through a lot of these difficult challenges in education in particular. But just for you personally, you started in journalism just right out of college, and pretty much immediately you focused on education reporting at US News and World Report, which you and I haven't discussed this, but I did a very quick stint there when I was in college. So we at least.
Really?
Yeah, it was 2 weeks long. So, but a one story kind of news organization that has certainly transitioned its focus and coverage over the last many years. But what drew you to journalism and to that particular topic, education?
Yeah. So I was a teenager and very relevant to my later commitment to writing and reporting about teachers and the power of teachers. A teacher got me hooked on journalism. I thought that I would be a novelist or a poet, but there was no poetry or fiction writing class to take in high school. So I took the newspaper class and just absolutely fell in love with it. And for me, education and journalism, or I guess like broader equity issues and journalism, were simultaneous passions that I was introduced to at the same time. My high school journalism teacher really encouraged us to, on the kids on the newspaper staff, to go outside of our own social bubbles. So for me, that meant walking across the proverbial cafeteria lines and talking to kids that I had no classes with, didn't live in my exact geographic neighborhood, and probably would never have spoken to if not for the call of journalism. And those were transformative conversations for me. I was a minority at my school as a white student whose parents had gone to college and who was on a college-bound trajectory. And so having conversations with students and peers who were saying, no, people look at me differently than they look at you. People expect me to be a welfare mom. Come sit in my class with me. I came and sat in their classes and I was like, this is babysitting, whereas I'm being challenged, you're being babysat. So I was very transformed again by those conversations, and kind of introduced to the idea that we would later call white privilege was made really clear to me. And then I saw very early too that journalism could be a way to help communities reckon with challenges that they were having, right? So by writing the stories that I was encountering through the privilege of having the opportunity to be a reporter and have these experiences outside my bubble, I also helped other people have those experiences, right? So teachers could hear that students felt that they didn't expect much of them. And the superintendent could hear how internally segregated we were and the problems that was causing for our school. And I saw that journalism had this unique power, not only to enable those encounters, but also to spark change. So I was hooked and never really looked back.
Just that's fascinating. It's an exercise in kind of individual and then societal empathy. What you mentioned a few aspects of kind of journalism that appeal to you, and I'm asking this of the kind of teenage era Elizabeth Green. One is essentially just sitting down with people and understanding their experiences. The other is, of course, seeing the impact that your work has on the broader community. And then there's lots of other activities within the journalistic enterprise that you didn't necessarily mention, but are there, like writing the article, doing the kind of research. What aspect of that do you feel like was the most enlivening for you?
That's such a good question. I remember I love to learn about people and their experiences. And so I remember being on the phone. Instead of doing my homework, I would just stay on the phone for like 3 hours or more. And it wasn't like to gossip about who was dating whom, or like get help with my math homework, which was my previous uses of the telephone at that time. But it was instead these long interviews to ask people about their life experience and their life story. And I think that I became completely, there's nothing better than to learn about other people, there's nothing better. And I think probably in particular for young people, because we see this a lot in our work engaging young people, like they just are so engineered to learn, and so curious. And so I think that, human curiosity about other people's experience can become either, especially for teenagers, alienating, right? Because you're like, well, I feel different, or I don't feel seen or heard. Or if you're given a chance to encounter other people in an authentic way, it can become incredibly liberating and freeing, because you cross that trajectory of what you didn't know and what you were worried might be true. And you fill it with like, oh, this is what they really think, and it's, I think that connection that can be fostered for journalists, we get to have it when we actually go out and do reporting in this really beautiful way. But then if we write well, and if we use photography well, video well, if we empower, like, takes the right opportunities and say, actually, my voice doesn't matter here. I'm just going to put this person's voice in the spotlight. If we do all that craft work right, which I also think was fun for me, for the aspiring novelist in me, I like that part too. If we do that part right, then other people also get that. Their sort of loneliness, alienation can be broken through and replaced with more authentic encounters with others. And I just think so much of what we're all challenged with in this moment in time is the ways that technology has exacerbated our alienation. And there's some like fancy ways we could fix that, but there's also some basic craft ways like journalism that just say, no, like there's a job that should be paid for socially that helps us all encounter each other better, and that storytelling is the way to do that. And there's kind of no replacement for it.
That's fascinating. And again, a reminder of kind of the individual people behind, well, essentially that journalism is ultimately about people and about connection with people. And as you said, allowing us as individuals to kind of break through whatever loneliness, alienation, inequities that might exist among us. Is that a fair way to kind of describe at least your belief and attitude towards journalism?
Yeah, and actually, when you put it that way, I want to emphasize that not all journalism accomplishes this, right? And I was so fortunate in my earliest introduction to the craft of journalism to have a teacher who really had a mission attitude about journalism that was deeply humane and rooted in seeing and elevating other people's experiences with accuracy, and not oriented toward inflaming discourse or further alienating people. And I want to be clear, journalism can do inflammatory damage. It absolutely can. And there's different kinds of journalism, right? And that realization is one that I was pushed to have in my first jobs in journalism, that, this utopian experience I had of it in high school, which can be so positive and so powerful, is not a foregone conclusion at all.
Well, I think that's an interesting topic to dive into. We'll might revisit that in the subsequent conversation, but I'll get us back on
Yeah.
kind of, because the great thing is, like, you and I can talk for hours on any number of things, so I have to stay on agenda. But one of the things that we wanted to talk with you about in the context of Chalkbeat that we thought would be interesting for the broader Google audience is talking a little bit about Chalkbeat's business model and approach in general. And what I mean by that is most news organizations are for-profit businesses, have been, particularly newspapers, in local and metropolitan markets, very lucrative for the owners. But Chalkbeat is one of the kind of leading lights in nonprofit journalism, supported by foundations and donors. I should also caveat that Google has recently partnered and supported with Chalkbeat a one-on-one partner project to help support your growth to other verticals and otherwise. But wanted to ask about how you developed this model and this approach. Why for profit? Why foundations? Why donors?
Yeah. So, and thank you, Google, for the support. Thank you, Ben, for leading that project with us. When I entered commercial journalism, which was kind of absolutely dominant at the time that I entered the workforce, as I said, I saw this contradiction between the mission of journalism that I had been imbued with in high school and the business model of journalism as it was practiced in most of the country and globally. I think that's even more true in many parts of the world, even than in the US. with some exceptions. But that contrast looks like, when the mission is profit, the mission that can sometimes exclude the kind of journalism that I described that I was able to do in high school. And it can actively enforce journalism that is less local, right, and much more global and national, and therefore more alienating from real lived experiences and that opportunity for connection. It can also take people away from where the truth is taking the story and toward where there's financial opportunity. And so what the journey that I've been on since my earliest days in the workforce was to say, well, what if the business model wasn't in tension with the mission, but actually was designed to support the mission? What would that look like? Because to me, the kind of journalism that I personally care about is a classic public good. It is something that everyone benefits from, whether they pay for it or not. It has all kinds of externalities associated with it, and yet we need it anyway. And so it's something that we have to find, just like health, just like education, just like the arts. It's something that we have to find ways collectively to subsidize outside of the context of markets. And so how do we do that? Well, one way to think about where we've landed is to start with how local news used to be paid for and distributed in our country. And in its heyday, that was through a classic bundle called the local regional newspaper. And that newspaper had all different kinds of sections. It had classified ads. It gave you the weather report. It literally told you what kind of clothes to wear to work or school that day. And there wasn't many other ways of finding that out. It told you where to go to see the movie that you wanted to see that weekend. It told you how your sports team did. And it had a monopoly on the printed audience, right? The audience who was looking at printed products, because of being this bundle that was absolutely essential to so many people's ability to find jobs, to get dressed, to follow the basic market news. And all of those very commercial commodities, commercially viable commodities, were subsidizing effectively what I think of as the vegetables of the media diet, which is things like coverage of schools, encounters with others, humanity, coverage of city council meetings, coverage of planning decisions in your community. And that worked because advertisers really liked putting their advertisements in print newspapers while they had a monopoly on print attention. When the internet, the ultimate unbundler, disrupted that monopoly, the commercial information pieces of the local news ecosystem splintered off from this bundle and became single topic products like weather.com or Craigslist or Fandango for movie listings. And I could go on and on. All of these things are single topics serving multiple geographies with very focused products. And
I should intervene here just with a little bit of additional point of fact on that. Newspaper organizations invested in a lot of these vertical businesses, some successful, some not. So kind of Auto Trader with the Guardian and Auto Classifieds in the UK, equivalents in the United States with a lot of the big chains. But keep going, because this is fascinating, I think, for people to understand.
That's amazing context. I didn't know that. Well, so I think the way that I understand what's happened now is that the subsidy has gone away because the advertisers are not going to major print publications. Advertising to newspapers used to be a $50 billion a year proposition, and it's been absolutely collapsing. The dollars annually going to newspapers have more than halved. So that money train does not exist in the same way anymore. Neither does the attention. And so what we're left with is the problem that the vegetables of the media diet are no longer have a subsidy mechanism. And so what we've said is, what if the business model was, for one thing, built in a digital native, unbundled understanding of how information travels, which looks like topical expertise that gets distributed through many different channels that reach diverse audiences, right? That's how we all find out the weather. There's one AccuWeather, but we're getting it in all kinds of different sources. That's how we find classified ads, right? There's many different channels where you can find them, but there's kind of one core technology that's successfully providing the core product, and on and on. So what if we took that model, but then acknowledge that model, in the case of civically relevant, non-commercially viable topics, will require a new form of subsidy? And so that's what Chalkbeat is, and that's what we're working with you guys to expand to new topic areas, as we did with the Vote Beat experiment that we did covering voting and election administration. We have single topic focus with multiple geographically served areas. And this works nicely from a distribution point of view, because it acknowledges that people are now, reading their news on our phones, or when we happen to turn on the TV news, or when we are talking with a friend over a chat platform, or getting something in a newsletter, right? All of these different kind of surfaces that are flowing in through our heads need to be populated with more vegetables to go along with the everything in our promotions folder, Gmail promotions folder. And we are in the business of getting the vegetables into as many streams as possible, and doing that better than anyone else by knowing a topic really well, and not acknowledging that if I may live in Washington, D.C., and that's where my son is in school, but I'm really not only interested in the updates about what's going on here for him, but how does that connect, excuse me, to the trends that my brothers in Colorado and Boston are experiencing? Or, what I heard is going great in Indianapolis, or whatever. We are all taking in global information. So the nonprofit piece of this is an acknowledgement of the requirement of a subsidy. So in the absence of advertising, what can be the subsidy, right? In the absence of that, what is it? Well, there's not that many kinds of money in the world. There's commercial money. People are willing to pay for a product. There's government money. We've decided collectively through our representative democracies or whatever mechanism that this is a public good priority to invest in. And then there's philanthropy, where the government might not be there yet, but individual philanthropists will support something that is a public good. And so at Chalkbeat, we are utilizing philanthropy first. We are open to government support if we can find the right ways to do it that protect our independence to cover the government vigorously. And then we, as a tertiary matter, are also going after all the commercial revenue we can to sort of subsidize the rest, but not the other way around, right? And that is just going to be the way that we have to do it if we want to still have civic news in our country and globally.
So that there's a lot to dig into. So I want to make sure we do dig into it. But before we do that, I just wanted to kind of play back what I heard you saying about kind of the need for an organization like Chalkbeat and its ilk, which is essentially for many years, newspapers essentially at the local level had a monopoly. I think you used the language, there was monopoly on audience attention and time, which essentially was a great attractor for local advertisers and to some extent national advertisers who were able to direct tens of billions of dollars into these organizations. And all of that money was a mechanism to essentially subsidize, that's the word you use, the vegetables of the media diet, i.e., coverage of city councils, education, the courts, et cetera.
Mhm.
But with the internet, essentially, internet disrupted that kind of monopoly
Yes.
of attention, and caused folks to essentially direct their attention to single topic products and
Yes.
services, from classifieds initially to individual kind of topics. And so what you guys are doing is emerging as a vertically focused, so a topically focused organization, focused obviously on education first, to cover that kind of social good
Yes.
and that the vegetables of the media diet that otherwise wouldn't get paid for. Is
Uh,
that right? Okay.
Perfect. Yes.
So the internet, uh, in this kind of narrative, the internet was kind of the great disruptor of that monopoly. Google, we're talking at Google, we are essentially a company built around the internet and on kind of the internet. What do you think about kind of Google's role in this particular narrative, as
Yeah.
well as, potentially, and this is a lot to address, but even in the solution going forward?
Yeah. Yeah. So, of course, Google is also an advertising company, right? Just like the news industry was really more of an advertising company than a service company at the end of the day. Google has a similar model in a lot of ways. Like the services that I'm getting, and believe me, I'm a Google customer in many different ways, are, of course, also subsidized by advertising. Um, so advertising dollars shifting in society is just a fact that I think is technologically driven and not the responsibility of any company or individual actor. It's a technical change in how attention um, is used and what we're all looking at, the surfaces we're looking at and using. So the responsibility, I think, of of Google and of Facebook and Twitter and the handful of others who have who now are monopolizing our attention in different but also parallel ways, I think, is just to be part of the subsidy and to find new arrangements that enable vegetables to survive. And I think that it's in the end, it's really going to just be a matter of money and shifting resources around, allocating them in a way that we can all find comfortable, but also leads to an outcome that is healthy for the society. And so, in the not too distant past, the publishers who had those advertising spoils took relative different paths of civic responsibility that were more straightforward, I think, than the decisions we're faced with today, because they were in the business of providing news. That was their clear business. And so families like, the Graham family that owned the Washington Post for years started as regional news publishers and made a civic commitment as part of their business objective and as part of their brand proposition as well. And it paid off, right? And taking on a risk like Watergate was a huge brand risk, but also a brand win in the long run for the Washington Post, because it built trust with the community, brand trust, by investing in something that was the truth, that was socially responsible. And I think the invitation that I have to every company that is kind of in the new business of the new kind of publishing, advertising, attention space is, let's learn from everyone who came before us, but adapt to our situation today and make a similar kind of commitment, but within our own environment. And the commitment is that we are going to see that win-win for all of our brands of standing up for the truth and investing in the truth, so that we can all have that, enriching our society, even though it will cost us sometimes in the short term to do it. Journalism is sometimes not this beautiful, happy, utopian thing, right? We all end up getting criticized at some point, but in the long run, it's good. And so, yeah, I hope that wasn't too obtuse, or I'm sure you'll recap it more clearly than I just said it.
No, no, no. I mean, that's useful, and obviously you're our guest, so it's part of this is understanding your perspective here. But it sounds like this is about, at least your perspective is, it's about kind of civic responsibility,
Yeah.
and making sure that we're all doing our part as member societies. I'll just not with I won't hit the hammer on the head too much, but I think through the work that we at Google have enacted with Google News Initiative, but also our product. We are a product and technology company, so that in fact should be at the core of what we're doing. But through Google News and fighting and combating misinformation, I think there's a lot that this organization, again speaking for myself, can be very proud of in its role in supporting a healthy, sustainable news ecosystem. But as with anything that is a difficult problem, there's always more to be done, and I know we're always engaging in these questions. One topic that we've discussed in the past, and then we'll get to some questions, is a bit of this notion, and I think this ties to your work with the American Journalism Project. So I'd like to hear a little bit about that and what you think the role of that organization is. But that organization is focused on kind of building out local, remaking kind of the local newspaper in a kind of digital nonprofit / donor and foundation funded era. So it's more of a location-based approach. Chalkbeat is a bit location and topical. Wanted to get a sense of two things. One is just how you think those hypotheses kind of work together, number one. And then number two, what are we solving for? And this gets to kind of the math, the back of the envelope, back of the napkin math around like how much money does it take in your estimation, and what resources are required to kind of fill in the vegetables portion of the media diet in the United States. So two big questions, but love your perspective on that, and then we'll get to audience questions.
Great. So in 2019, I co-founded the American Journalism Project, as Ben said, and that was out of my belief that in order to solve the local news problem, we are missing somewhere between $1 and $3 billion annually in resources spent on the vegetables. And that can look like Chalkbeat model, that can look like taking a traditional kind of your town post or your town gazette and putting it in a more digital and nonprofit environment. It could look many different ways, but whatever way you slice it, we're going to need to dramatically increase the resources spent on that public good proposition in the US, not to mention globally, in order for democracies to survive. And so how do we get there? How do we get there? It's a huge amount of money to increase the expenditure of. Well, the way we are going to have to get there is by creating a new social sector something that used to be dependent on a commercial sector is going to have to transition and become a social sector. And a fuel of social sectors is individual and corporate philanthropy. That is a way that innovation happens in the social sector, or that new sectors are created. And so the American Journalism Project is the first ever venture philanthropy firm dedicated to local news, to creating a thriving and flourishing, rebuilt, reimagined local news sector that truly serves the democracy. And what they're doing is they're making consequential investments in the institutions that will be that future of local news, the nonprofit institutions. Whether that is an organization like Chalkbeat, which is serving multiple regions with one topic, or an organization like Berkeley Side, which expanded into Oakland with great support also from the Google News Initiative, partnering with the American Journalism Project, which covers many different topics in those two regions of Berkeley and Oakland. The models look diverse. There are more models than that in between, but the point is to grow the sector, to build a new field. And that's what it's been really exciting to see the American Journalism Project do.
Okay, and that's super fascinating. I think this is an interesting, again, for those of us who enjoy math, it'd be interesting, or it's the number that you articulated, $1 billion to $3 billion to kind of fill in the gap and pay for the vegetables on the kind of media diet. That presumably is going to be funded by and provided by government, commercial donors, funders, et cetera. And some of that is already out there in the form of
Yeah.
not the existing commercial news. So the remaining gap might be a lot smaller, which is actually a much more achievable kind of number than the kind of tens of billions of dollars and 50 billions of dollars that you were articulating before. Very cool.
Yeah,
so,
we don't have to replace the full amount that commercial advertising used to provide. We don't.
No. And that's a again, what are we solving for? That kind of digging into that a little bit more is something that probably society in general would benefit from.
Yeah.
So we have a handful of, we have, I think, 5 questions in the queue right now in 15 minutes. So we're going to transition to some questions. And again, for those of you who might have some additional questions, hit on topics of education, journalism, being an entrepreneur, or anything that might tickle your fancy. Okay. So we have a question from Henry Faulkner. So the onslaught of misinformation is a growing problem. How do you see journalists and news organizations and educators combating this challenge?
Yeah, great question. Garbage in, garbage out, right? And so that is, I think, the line that to me best explains many of the challenges that we're facing as a society. We have a lot of garbage floating through the system, whether that's very polarizing news sources that inflame rather than connect, or whether that's active disinformation campaigns that are purposefully trying to deceive people for a political gain. There's only 2 ways to get rid of garbage. You have to, 1, regulate it so that it has a place to go and it has a mechanism for going there. And then you, 2, have to plant trees, right? You have to put something in its place that will take its place. And so we can't solve the problem of citizens who aren't informed with accurate news and information in the absence of accurate news and information. And yet we don't have it right now. We may have a lot of news, national news, more than we can even accommodate in our feeds, but we don't have nearly enough news about actionable things that we can do in our own communities that are grounded in realities of those real communities. So to me, the challenge of personally living as a human in this moment in history is partially the powerlessness that I feel when I think about the climate challenges, the educational challenges I described, our racial equity challenges, and I think about them in the absence of anything I could do about it in my actual community. Because then I feel powerless to change anything. I feel like I'm at the whim of history. But if I can have access to, well, this meeting is happening in your community, these people in your community have taken this positive action or this negative action, and this is the way it's playing out and something you could do to enact change, that is a complete game changer. And always, for me personally, the closer I get to understanding what's really going on, right? Like when I cross the cafeteria line and sit down and have a real connection, authentic exchange, that's when I feel less hopeless. That's when I feel like we all can get along, maybe. And so we can't just regulate the dis and misinformation. We also absolutely have to find ways to give something else to engage around, something positive and constructive. Education is essential in all of this. I am totally patting myself on the back, my high school self, for picking education and journalism as passions, because they are really making themselves clear as high of a priority they need to be, how high of a priority they need to be. They're making their value clear. Education is the way that we help young people navigate the new information landscape that they find themselves in. And we have to teach kids how to have civic literacy. We absolutely have to. And the best way, I think, to do that is to give them civic experiences. So anyway, I could go on and on, but I agree with the reader that with the implication of this question that education and journalism are essential in that fight.
Thanks for the thoughtful answer, and thank you, Henry, for the question. Let's get to the next question. From Mason Johnston. Is there any advice you would give to a young person considering leaving the corporate world to pursue some kind of career in journalism?
I love this kind of question. I think that it's a really exciting area to enter. I think it's a place where people young and old can make a really big difference. The problem that we have to solve for is just as much a business model problem as it is a journalism problem, if not more so. I hope Ben and I have made that abundantly clear. And so I think all kinds of skills are needed, really. Like, I really see this as a one of the essential acts that we all have to right now commit to if we want our trajectory to go in a positive direction and to avoid social collapse, disaster, more hopelessness and fear. So there's many causes, but we welcome you into ours if it speaks to you. And there's many different skills that are needed. So definitely think about the members of the Institute for Nonprofit News. Those are great organizations. Look at the organizations AJP is supporting. Look at us at Chalkbeat. We're about 75 people now and always looking for new folks, whether it's an accountant or someone with more technical skills. There's all different kinds of skills that can transition into journalism. And the best way to become a reporter is always to just try it, to do reporting. And unfortunately, the career pipelines have really suffered from what's happening to journalism. Journalism jobs have declined more than coal miner jobs in the last 15 years. So there's huge challenges to create these new jobs. That's where the $1 to $3 billion needs to go, right? To creating jobs. So I'm not going to pretend it's going to be easy, but I certainly think that it's important.
It's a great question, great answer, and kind of at Google, the other dimension of what a journalist is has definitely been pushed forward. So at Google, many folks are technologists, product managers, and the like. Those skills are critically important in news organizations, whether on the kind of newsroom side of telling stories through interactives or multimedia, or obviously on the business side, where kind of the needs for supporting the organization are highly critical. So a little plug for that. And obviously, if you're at Google and you're interested in journalism, please reach out to the teams that work on the Google News Initiative. Next question from Maura Youngman. What qualitative or quantitative success metrics, great question, do you look to when measuring the impact of your journalism, and specifically with regard to sustainable nonprofit journalism?
Yeah, that is a great question. So I think one of the interesting things about the journalism field is because we were commercially subsidized for so long, those of us doing the kind of civic work honestly had almost no metrics of success. Except for awards. That was really it. Winning a Pulitzer was the capstone of a career, maybe publishing a book. Getting on the front page, right? They are all incredibly qualitative metrics. And then, of course, just like so many other industries, the internet and new technologies have enabled us to know way too much about, and at the same time, almost nothing at all about a whole other dimension of our work, which is how many people are reading it. And so just like so many industries, journalists have become, I think, in a cynical read, captive to audience analytics, and in a more optimistic read, pushed in a good way to think about their readers more. And so for me at Chalkbeat, the way that I've used that push and our team has used that push is to say, let's articulate in a really clear way, what is our theory of change? What kind of thing are we what does success look like? What is our vision of success? And having a mission statement about that work was the first important step for us and other newsrooms to take to clarify what metrics do we care about. For us, that is, as I said at the outset, have we informed decision-making and debate? And that's not necessarily going to be proven by the number of people who clicked on and read all the way to the bottom of an article. It also depends on the quality of the person who read the article, right? Because if 3 people read an article, but they're the 3 people who stand to make a change about what the article is about, then you don't have to be upset that it was 3. You can applaud because the change gets made in the world. So what we look for is a combination of how many people have read it, and do we have evidence that this article changed the decision-making process and the debate, the nature of the debate and conversation, what people understand. There's a lot more to think about in this area. There are some political scientists who are interested in the study of media impact have additional interesting takes here. It's something that we'll be working with Ben and his team on, I believe, in our partnership going forward as well. And so it's another example of a rich area where people with non-journalistic skills can help journalists.
Yeah, 100%. And so thoughts on how to build on that and improve on it would be highly welcome. So reach out to the Google News Initiative teams internally. Next question. I think we have 2 more, and then we'll do a little bit of a wrap up. From John Budd. I believe that is, in your opinion, are there limits to, in your opinion, are there limits to the sorts of problems in the U.S. education system that can be solved by a specific targeted policies, funding, et cetera? Are these issues, are there issues that can only be solved by broad cultural shifts? So in education, kind of thinking about solutions. What are your thoughts on that question?
That's a great question. So I could speak from my own reporting that I wrote a book called Building a Better Teacher. That's a reported account of the research that we've learned about what makes a good teacher and the way in which systems in the US have not set teachers up for success in ways that would help students learn. So, and I also did reporting in other countries, in particular in Japan, to compare. And I think there are some deep cultural reasons why our education system in the US has challenges that don't exist in some other countries. And those have to do with our attitude towards learning. And so I invite you to read my book to hear more about that. But I definitely agree that that's one cultural shift. We also, the education system in the US, like so many other institutions, is very deeply imbued with the legacy of white supremacy of our country, right? So it was literally illegal for Black people to read, period, much less enter a school with adequate resources that white students were receiving. So we have a lot of challenges also that are embedded in the cultural, deep cultural challenges in our country around racism. So there's definitely some cultural threads that need to change, I believe, in American education. But there's also a lot of concrete, just concrete investments that work. And we cover those all day long at Chalkbeat, right? So there's a lot of things that can work, like more money does help schools. It turns out that is what the research points to us. And many other programs work. It helps to have coordination across multiple pieces of the education system, which are woefully uncoordinated much of the time. And a lot more things that can change, even while cultural change will take longer.
So we unfortunately are going to have to bring this conversation to an end. Thank you for those of you who submitted questions, and thank you, Elizabeth, for joining us. Just to summarize a little bit about what we've talked about, and this was hard because we did cover a lot of territory, reminding us of the territory we traveled. We talked about the kind of impact of COVID on young people in the education system and kind of educational stressors. The point that I'm really glad you pointed out was around Black and brown boys, particularly being affected disproportionately in terms of kind of working, learning from home, and how that, to your point just now, kind of ties into broader systemic racism built into education and lots of institutions in the United States. We also talked obviously about the role of the internet in particular in changing the business model, user attention, et cetera, for kind of news as defined really broadly by the local newspaper, and how the internet wrought the kind of great unbundling of that product, and how you guys at Chalkbeat are trying to serve a role of filling in the vegetables on that media consumption plate, and hopefully extending to other verticals, and then other localities with the work at American Journalism Project. And what's going to be required is a meaningful amount of societal support to be able to fill in those particular gaps. And I think the one thing that I think is essential in kind of coming away from this conversation is reminding ourselves of the role that journalism essentially plays in building empathy and creating a kind of narrative. So I do think the young teenage Elizabeth Green kind of going around her school and kind of investigating and learning would be very kind of proud of the work that you have done to date in your career.
Thank you.
I'm very excited about, I think, all the work to come. So thank you very much,
so
Elizabeth.
much. It's so great to be here, and it's so great to work with you, Ben, always.
Well, thank you very much, Google, and more talks at Google will be coming soon.